So we're back. It went off, but we're back. Okay, let's start reading. Let me put the music back on. I gotta have some kind of music. Woohoo! Woohoo! It's 2:30, 2:35. Okay, so we covered a lot of materials, but let's start reading A Universal History of the United States of America. And I'm going to get a sip of soda pop because I'm thirsty. Again, I encourage you to vote. Okay, be patriotic and walk, run, ride, or skip to your voting poll. Don't do it by mail. They get lost and they're not counted properly. Please vote in person. Okay. Mr. John Adams says that he laid the foundation of the American Revolution with an energy and with those masterly talents with no other man possessed, and is justly considered as the first martyr to American liberty. The insults which the inhabitants constantly experienced from the soldiers increased their animosity towards them to such a degree as to lead to violence and bloodshed. On the 2nd of March, 1770, an affray took place between a party of soldiers of the 29th Regiment and some rope makers in front of Mr. Gray's rope walk. This was followed by a more alarming outrage on the 5th. The indignant populace pressed upon and insulted the soldiers, while under arms, and assailed them with clubs, sticks, and snowballs, covering stones. Being dared to fire by the mob, 6 of the soldiers discharged their muskets, which killed 3 of the citizens, and wounded 5 others. The effect of this was electric. The town was instantly in commotion, and the mass of the people were so exasperated that it required the utmost exertions to prevent their rallying and driving the British Myrmidons out of town. And nothing but an assurance that the troops should be withdrawn prevented this resort to force. The captain of the party and 8 men were brought to trial. 2 of the men were found guilty. The captain and the other men were acquitted. A general meeting of the inhabitants was immediately assembled in Faneuil Hall, who unanimously resolved that no armed force should be suffered longer to reside in the capital, and a committee was appointed to wait on the governor and request the immediate removal of the troops, and the governor refused to act under pretense of want of authority, but Colonel Daly Ample, alarmed at the state of things, proposed to withdraw the 29th Regiment, which was more culpable than any other, but he was informed that not a soldier should be left in town. He was reluctantly compelled to comply, and within 4 days not a redcoat remained. This tragical affair produced the deepest impressions on the minds of the people, and the anniversary of the massacre of the 5th of March, 1770, was commemorated for many years, and orations delivered, which unfolded the blessings of civil liberty, the horrors of slavery, the dangers of standing armies, and the rights of the colonies. These annual orations administered fuel to the fire of liberty and kept it burning with an insistent flame, and in no small degree promoted the cause of the colonies in a manner that served to give a deeper glow to the flame of liberty. In the spring of 1773, the schooner Gasp was stationed at Providence to prevent smuggling, and the conduct of the commander having exasperated the inhabitants, 200 men entered on board the schooner at night and compelled the captain and crew to go ashore, and then set fire to the vessel. And always remember, vessels are ships, and ships are vessels. The government offered a reward of £500 for the apprehension of any of the persona engaged in this outrage, but such was the spirit and anonymity of the people that this pecuniary inducement produced no effect, and the authors of the outrage could not be discovered. About this period, the letters of Governor Hutchinson and Mr. Oliver to their friends in England, urging the government to adopt more decisive and vigorous measures to coerce the colonies into submission, were discovered and sent back to America by Dr. Franklin, which, being published by the Assembly of Massachusetts, greatly contributed to inflame the public mind and exasperate the people against these officers of the crown, who were justly charged with having shamefully betrayed their trust and the people whose rights it was their duty vigilantly to guard. Whist and other duties were repealed, that on tea was retained for the sole and avowed object of maintaining the power, which Parliament had asserted of collecting a revenue in America. Is that the tea tax? The tax on tea. The minstrel scheme was cunning and artful, and he did not in the least degree deceive intelligence of the Americans. The object was to cheat the colonies out of their rights by collecting an indirect and imperceptible duty, little more than nominal in amount, which, however, is acquiescence and would have been an admission of the principle or the right of Britain to raise a revenue in America. The tea tax, it was an attempt to obtain covertly and by fraud what they had attempted but failed to obtain openly by force. In the first place, measures were adopted, openly and explicitly, for taxing the colonies, the duties to be paid directly by the consumer, but being unable to enforce this act, it was repealed, accompanied with a declaration of the rights of Parliament to tax the Americans in all cases whatsoever. This naked assertion of a right in all cases, the application of it had been attempted and abandoned did not give the Americans much concern. They would not have cared if the British had kept that assertion of a right to do wrong on their statute book, as long as two countries existed, provided they had not attempted to exercise their assumed right. But the advocates of American taxation seem to be sensible that the bare assertion of a right after the unsuccessful attempt to enforce it would amount to but little, and the conclusions obviously following the abandonment of the first attempt to tax the Americans would be left in their full force under the circumstances in which the two countries were placed. Therefore the right must be enforced, or it might be considered as virtually abandoned. But this had been once attempted without success. A more ingenious mode, therefore, might be devised, or one less likely to give alarm to the colonies. The stamp duties were a direct tax, as the duty constituted the entire value of a sum paid, but a trifling impost would not be perceived as the duty of the article. The bitter pill which it was intended to make the colonies swallow was gilded with sugar. The duty was more artfully disguised than a single impost. It was, in fact, no additional burden on the consumers of tea, it being only a different mode of collecting the duty which had before been paid. Yet this alteration of the mode involved the right and power of Parliament to establish revenue system in America. According to the former regulations, the teas of the India Company were first brought to England, where a duty was paid before they were sent to the colonies. The scheme was merely to change the place and mode of collecting the duty. It was to be paid in America instead of England, for which purpose custom regulations were established and officers appointed. A duty of 3d on a pound of tea would not be felt by the people, and this, or rather a greater duty, had been paid before in England, so that instead of the burdens of the people being increased, they were rather lightened by this new regulation. So artfully disguised was this scheme. It is a maxim with many politicians, and too generally correct, that the people will not be alarmed or excited by any principle, however it may be fraught with danger, that they must feel and suffer before their fears will arouse them into action. But this maxim did not hold solve to resist, at the hazard of their lives, a principle calculated to undermine the foundation of their liberty, although its operation at the time was not felt in the slightest degree. The resistance of the Americans to the scheme of collecting a duty on tea in America instead of England was the resistance of the principle which that scheme involved, solely as no additional burden was thereby imposed on the people. Now I know through my history, and I did visit Edmonton, North Carolina. That's where they first had the meetings, and it was the women that got together in regards to the taxation on tea, and they wrote proposals to end that taxation on tea before the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so anyhow, it is believed that this only instance... Okay, so let's back up. So artfully disguised was this scheme. It is a maxim with many politicians, and too generally correct, that the people will not be alarmed or excited by any principle. However, it may be fraught with danger, and they must feel and suffer before their fears will arouse them into action. But this maxim did not hold true with the Americans. They saw the danger and resolved to resist at the hazard of their lives a principle calculated to undermine the foundation